With housing prices projected to drop more than 25% and mortgage rates at an all-time high of 7.7%, the upcoming 2024 housing crash is going to be much, much worse than anything we've ever seen before. When the investor and billionaire Warren Buffett was asked this year about what would happen to the commercial real estate market,
but it all has consequences, and I think we are starting to see the consequences.
His response was elusive. Buffett is not known for making bold statements, which makes this comment all the more alarming. Just how did we get here, and what can we expect as we enter into the crash of one of the worst housing bubbles of all time? First of all, let's take a look at the increase in housing prices in the last 35 years. Housing prices have continued to increase with inflation, and that's absolutely normal. But if you look at inflation-adjusted housing prices using the Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index, you'll see that we're way past the 2006 housing market peak. The market is incredibly unstable, and these housing prices with rising interest rates, layoffs, and record-high mortgage prices are impossible to maintain. Housing prices have continued to rise on a year-on-year basis for the last 100 years, but a 74% increase in prices after adjusting for inflation in just 10 years is absurd. We are in a housing bubble, and there's just no way around it. Just last year, Jerome Powell was reported saying that a housing bubble had formed during the pandemic and a reset was on its way. We probably in the housing market have to go through a correction to get back to a balanced market, and a difficult correction is already ongoing. A look back at the 2008 housing crisis clearly shows us that a severe decline in interest rates played a key role in creating a housing bubble. Surprisingly, however, even after the crash, the Federal Reserve has continuously suppressed interest rates and is only now increasing them. At this point, however, it might already be too late. A recent report from real estate brokerage Redfin showed that the total value of U.S. homes had fallen from a record high of $47.7 trillion in June 2022 to just $45.3 trillion at the end of the year, a decline of around $2.3 trillion or 4.9%. This fall marked the fastest drop in housing prices since the 2008 financial crisis, when home values plunged by 5.8% from June to December. The report also showed that the median price of a home in the U.S. was down 11.5% from $433,133 in May to $383,249 in January. Now, let's move on to how I know there's going to be a housing crash. We know that there's a housing bubble, and even the chair of the Federal Reserve has confirmed this. But how do we know that a housing crash is coming in 2024? To understand this, we first need to take a look at how the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage works. You probably know that the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is actually a derivative of the 10-year Treasury note. The 10-year Treasury note is a kind of loan that you can give to the government. You loan the government your money, and in return, you get your money back after 10 years with a fixed amount of interest. As of the time of writing, the current rate of interest on the 10-year Treasury note is 4.34%, which means that you'll get 4.34% interest on the money you lend to the government. Now, here's the interesting part. The government also issues a 2-year Treasury note, which gives you a return of 4.73% after just 2 years. Normally, the direct opposite of this would be true. You would get a higher interest rate if you loan the money for a longer period of time, but since the market is unstable right now, the rates are reversed. This is called an inverted yield curve, and these curves are the most clear sign of an upcoming recession. Now, I said upcoming because that's how it works. While an inverted yield curve does mean that a recession is right around the corner, it doesn't mean that a recession is going to happen as soon as the curve appears. If you take a look at this graph by JP Morgan, you'll see that every time we've seen an inversion, there's been a recession, and that, on average, a recession starts 14 months after an inversion first appears. At the very best, 19 months is all you've got before the recession starts. Now, the current inversion first appeared around 14 months ago, which means 2024 is pretty much guaranteed to be the next 2008, if not worse. The last 15 years of cheap debt have propped up the U.S.'s housing market, and with the Federal Reserve now looking to increase interest rates once again after a meeting in September, a lot of banks in the U.S. might be looking for some tough times ahead. You see the way that real estate loans work in the U.S.? Commercial real estate properties get what is called a non-recourse debt. What this means is that in case housing markets crash and the debtor can't pay back the loan, the bank gets access to the property. Now, what if the value of the property is less than what the bank originally loaned to the borrower? Well, in that case, the bank has to eat up the losses. Let's look at a simple example. Say that an investor decides to set up an office building and borrows $30 million from the bank. Originally, the building was supposed to be worth at least $30 million since that's what it cost to build it. Now let's say that the housing market crashes and the value of the finished building now falls to $20 million. In this case, the investor could just give the bank the finished building and walk away, which means the bank just suffered a $10 million loss. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger recently talked about this in an interview too.
But I do think that the hollowing out of the downtowns in the United States and elsewhere in the world is going to be quite significant and quite unpleasant. I think the country will get through it all right, but as they say, it will often involve a different set of owners.
The buildings don't go away, but the owners do. This might sound crazy, but it has already started happening. It is estimated that there are about $1.4 trillion worth of these bad loans that are going to impact the U.S. market. As if all this wasn't bad enough, there are already real estate developers who are defaulting on their loan. Starwood, a private real estate firm in Florida with $120 billion worth of assets under its management, just defaulted on a $212.5 million loan on an office building in Atlanta. Coincidentally, a report by Bloomberg also suggested that office buildings in the U.S. were the ones most at risk of defaulting on loan payments. The report estimated that these buildings could fall over 40% in value once a housing crisis hits. Another dangerous outcome of the housing crisis is going to be its effect on small banks. It is estimated that most of the commercial real estate loans aren't handed out by large banks like JP Morgan or Wells Fargo, but instead by small regional banks. According to Goldman Sachs, 80% of commercial real estate loans come from regional banks. Jerome Powell also talked about how exposed regional banks were to defaulting. The chair of the Federal Reserve said,
there will be losses for sure. You can drive down through most downtowns, in many downtowns anyway, and see buildings that are empty and things like that. But commercial real estate is not a principal risk or a major risk for the very largest banks. It is much more for regional and really the smaller banks have proportionally a much larger exposure to real estate.
Now, this doesn't mean that large banks are safe from the effects of a housing crisis. According to a March report, JP Morgan said that it expects about 21% of outstanding office loans in commercial mortgage-backed securities will eventually default. So, what can you expect once the housing crisis eventually does hit? Higher mortgage payments. People who bought homes thinking they'd be able to finance them by renting them out on Airbnb are up for a shock. Mortgage rates are already at an all-time high, and once a housing crisis hits, they're only going to go up. Homeowners can expect their monthly mortgage payments to double or even triple, which is going to force a lot of homes to foreclose. As regional banks start to feel the pressure of large loans defaulting, they're most likely going to take a step back from lending in general. This means that a lot of locally run businesses are going to have to face a lot of difficulties when trying to get access to credit, slowing business growth. All of this, combined with rising interest rates, is also going to fuel massive layoffs. Lots of big companies have already started layoffs to prepare for this. It's like Warren Buffett said in a recent interview.
But it all has consequences, and I think we are starting to see the consequences.
If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button. That was all for today.